I drained the lake under their power plant at midnight. I didn't sneak around. I didn't cut any cables. I didn't damage a single bolt on their machines. I just turned a handle my father installed almost 40 years ago, and by the time the engineers figured out what was happening, the water that had been holding up their million-dollar project was already disappearing beneath their feet. The funny thing is, I warned them more than once. I showed them the paperwork, the property lines, the easement records, everything. They just didn't think a quiet guy with an old lake and 2 dogs would actually follow through. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The story really started the morning I saw the flags. It was early spring, one of those mornings when the air is cold but the sun is already strong enough to make the water shine. I was walking along the west shore with my dogs, Baron and Murphy, both of them half Labrador and half Chaos, when I noticed the little pink markers stuck into the dirt near the waterline. At first I thought it was a survey crew passing through, maybe checking erosion or something routine. That kind of thing happens from time to time, and usually someone leaves a notice. But the way these flags were placed bothered me. They weren't random. They curve along the shoreline in a neat arc, and when I followed that arc with my eyes, it cut right across a section of land I knew better than my own living room. My property, my lake. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those flags while Baron sniffed at one of them and Murphy tried to dig a hole next to another. The lake itself looked exactly the way it always had. Calm water, a few ducks gliding across the surface, nothing unusual. But those little flags didn't belong there. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos. I sent them to the Westbend Homeowners Association that afternoon with a simple message asking who had placed survey markers on my shoreline. I didn't get an answer until the next morning. When the email came in, it was short and polite in the way that usually means someone is avoiding the real question. They said they were working on an infrastructure improvement project for the benefit of the community, and that more information would be shared at the next HOA meeting. That was the entire explanation. No mention of the fact that the markers were on land that had been registered to my family since 1976. No mention of permission. Just a vague statement about community benefit. Normally, I don't attend HOA meetings. After 30 years working with the Army Corps of Engineers, I've had enough meetings to last the rest of my life. But something about that email made my stomach tighten. A few days later, I found myself sitting in a folding chair in the high school gym where the HOA liked to hold their big gatherings. The place was packed, which was unusual for West Bend. Most people in our neighborhood prefer to complain online instead of showing up in person. But that night the stage was full of board members and the front rows were crowded with residents. At the center of the table sat Carla Whitmore, the new HOA president. She had only been in charge for about 6 months, but in that time, she had already turned the board into something a lot more aggressive than it used to be. She wore a navy blazer and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who expected every decision she made to be accepted without argument. When the meeting opened for questions, I raised my hand. She saw it. I know she did, but she called on 3 other people first before finally nodding toward me. "Yes, Mr. Harland," she said with a tight smile. "Do you have a question?" I stood up and kept my voice steady. "I'd like to know why survey flags have been placed along the shoreline of my lake." A small ripple moved through the crowd. Carla glanced at a folder in front of her, then looked back at me with the same practiced smile. "The lake forms part of the neighborhood ecosystem," she said. "Our consultants have determined it will play a key role in an upcoming energy initiative." I asked her to clarify what that meant. She adjusted the microphone slightly and explained that the HOA had partnered with a company called Greenspark Energy to build a small hydroelectric installation that would provide backup power for the neighborhood during outages. According to her, the lake would be part of the system. I remember feeling a strange mix of confusion and disbelief when she said that. "You can't build anything on that lake," I told her. "It's private property." Carla didn't seem bothered. She flipped through a few pages in her folder and replied that their consultants believe a portion of the water fell within a community greenbelt designation. I told her that wasn't possible. My father dug that lake himself back in the 70s. The property lines have been recorded and verified more than once over the years. But Carla just smiled again and thanked me for my input before moving on to the next question. Just like that. Conversation over. When the meeting ended, people gathered in small groups around the gym, talking about renewable energy and backup power like it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to West Bend. I walked out to the parking lot and noticed a couple of men in construction vests talking with one of the board members near a pickup truck. One of them said something about bringing equipment in the following week if the ground stayed dry. That was the moment I realized the meeting hadn't been a discussion at all. It had been a presentation. The decision had already been made. Over the next few days, I watched the situation change faster than I expected. Trucks began arriving early in the morning. At first, they parked on the common green near the lake. Then flatbeds started unloading metal crates and large pieces of equipment marked with the bright green logo of Greenspark Energy. Signs appeared along the shoreline announcing the future site of the Westbend Community Energy Initiative. I called the HOA office and left a message for Carla. She didn't return the call. I sent another email with copies of the property documents attached. No response. One afternoon, I walked down to the edge of the water again and stood there watching workers assemble scaffolding on a floating platform that had been anchored near the southern end of the lake. They worked quickly, like a crew that had already been told everything was approved. When I asked one of them who authorized the project, he shrugged and said the HOA had the permits. That night, I dug through the old filing cabinet in my father's study and pulled out the original plat map, along with the deed and the easement records tied to the water system. Everything was exactly the way I remembered. The lake was entirely within the Heartland property boundary. I scanned the documents and sent them to an attorney friend of mine who specialized in land disputes. He called me the next morning and confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no legal right to build anything on that lake. We drafted a formal cease and desist letter and delivered it to the HOA office. Their reply came 2 days later. It didn't acknowledge the cease and desist. Instead, it questioned the interpretation of my documents and suggested there might be a boundary discrepancy that required further review. In other words, they weren't stopping. Construction continued. By the end of the week, the floating platform had grown into something that looked a lot like a small industrial site sitting in the middle of my water. Metal frames, electrical boxes, pipes, cables. Floodlights were installed so the crews could work after sunset. The noise carried across the lake and into my yard late into the night. I tried calling the sheriff's office once when I saw a truck drive across the edge of my property to reach the shoreline. The dispatcher told me the same thing they always say in situations like that. It sounded like a civil dispute and would need to be handled through legal channels. In the meantime, the machines kept running. One evening around 11, I stepped out onto my deck and saw someone standing on the platform under the floodlights. Even from that distance, I recognized the shape of Carla Whitmore's blazer. She was talking with a group of engineers and pointing toward the far bank of the lake. The whole scene looked like something out of a commercial for a tech company. People smiling, lights reflecting on the water, everyone convinced they were building something important. I shouted across the lake that the land they were standing on didn't belong to them. Carla turned, raised one hand in a slow wave, and then went back to her conversation. That wave stayed in my head for a long time. Not angry, not nervous, just confident, like someone who already knew she was going to win. A couple mornings later, I woke up and walked outside to find fresh tire tracks cut across the grass behind my house leading toward the shoreline. Whoever had driven there during the night had stopped just short of the dock and then turned around. The tracks were deep enough to leave a pattern I could see from 20 feet away. I stood there looking at them and felt something shift in the back of my mind. Up to that point, I had still believed the situation would resolve itself through paperwork and lawyers. But the more I watched the project grow on the lake my father built, the more it became clear that Westbend HOA wasn't planning to slow down. They were planning to finish before anyone could stop them. What they didn't know was that the lake they were using had one feature they had never bothered to ask about. A feature my father installed decades ago when he first built the basin. Something buried deep below the surface that almost nobody remembered anymore. And when I finally realized exactly where their platform had been anchored, I understood something else too. They had built their entire project on top of the worst possible place they could have chosen. For the next few days, I kept hoping the whole thing would slow down. Not stop, maybe, but at least pause long enough for the legal side to catch up. That didn't happen. If anything, things moved faster. By the following Thursday, the trucks were arriving before sunrise. I would hear the engines first, a low rumble rolling across the water, and by the time I walked outside with my coffee, the shoreline would already be busy with workers unloading equipment. They didn't act like people working on disputed property. They acted like people finishing a job on schedule. The floating platform had doubled in size by then. What started as a small barge was now a full work deck with scaffolding and 2 large generators bolted near the rear. Every day something new appeared. Steel frames, pipe sections, crates of electrical gear. I started writing everything down. License plates, company names, timestamps. I took pictures from the dock and from the hill behind the house. My attorney told me to document everything. Courts move slowly, he said, but documentation matters when the time comes. The problem was the crews weren't waiting for courts. They were pouring concrete on that platform by the end of the week. One afternoon, I walked down to the fence they had set up along the shoreline and asked to speak with whoever was supervising the work. A man in a hard hat came over and listened while I explained the situation. I showed him the property map on my phone. He studied it for about 5 seconds and then told me his instructions came from Greenspark and the HOA. He wasn't authorized to stop anything. When I asked if they had verified the ownership of the lake, he shrugged and said permits had already been approved. That word kept coming up. Permits, approvals, partnerships. Everyone seemed to believe those words were stronger than the fact that the land itself didn't belong to them. I called the sheriff's office again that evening after another truck crossed the edge of my property to reach the shoreline. The deputy who arrived was polite and patient, but his answer was the same as before. It looked like a civil matter. Without an immediate safety risk, they couldn't force the crews to leave. I showed him the survey flags and the equipment sitting on the water. He took a few notes and said I should continue working through my attorney. As his cruiser pulled away, the generators on the platform started up again and the lights flickered on across the lake. That night, the whole site stayed lit until after midnight. The water reflected the floodlights so brightly it looked like a stadium. I stood on the deck for a while watching the workers move around the platform. Carla showed up sometime around 11 wearing the same navy blazer she wore at the meeting, only now she had a bright safety vest over it. She walked along the edge of the barge with a clipboard, pointing at different sections while 2 engineers nodded beside her. At one point, she laughed at something someone said, and the sound carried faintly across the water. I remember thinking that none of them looked worried. They looked proud, like they were unveiling something impressive. When I finally went inside, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the platform sitting in the middle of the lake where my father used to fish from a small aluminum boat. The next morning, I found the HOA newsletter in my mailbox. Page 2 featured a full spread about the Westbend Community Energy Initiative. There was even a rendering showing the finished system. A sleek generator housing mounted on a floating base, solar backup panels along the shoreline, and a caption that read powering a sustainable future. They didn't even use the name of the lake in the article. They called it Lake Parcel B. That bothered me more than I expected. My father never called it anything except the lake. He dug that basin by hand with rented equipment and stubborn patience over the course of 2 summers. I was 17 when he installed the clay lining and stocked the water with bass and bluegill. Back then, the idea that anyone else might someday claim it would have sounded ridiculous. But now there it was in black and white in a neighborhood newsletter. A parcel, a resource, something the HOA apparently believed it could redesign whenever it wanted. I drove to the county assessor's office later that day, hoping to get updated boundary overlays that would make the situation clearer. The clerk I spoke with looked uncomfortable as soon as she pulled up the records. According to her screen, the property lines were flagged for review due to an ongoing zoning discussion connected to the energy project. When I asked who flagged them, she didn't have an answer. She printed copies of the original plat map and handed them back to me with an apologetic expression. The next stop was the zoning department itself. The man I met there didn't deny the lake belonged to my family. He simply explained that renewable infrastructure projects often received expedited consideration because they benefited the community. When I pointed out that the community didn't own the land, he leaned back in his chair and said the boundary issue would ultimately be decided through the courts. Until then, the project could continue. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it told me everything I needed to know about the situation. The project had momentum now, and momentum was something paperwork rarely stopped. When I returned home that afternoon, another piece of equipment had been delivered to the platform. A large metal cylinder that looked suspiciously like part of a turbine assembly. 2 workers were guiding it into position with a crane mounted on the barge. I watched the whole process from the dock while talking with my attorney on the phone. He agreed the HOA was pushing the limits of what they could get away with legally, but the timeline for obtaining an emergency injunction was uncertain. Courts were slow, he reminded me again. Weeks at best, possibly months. The problem was the crews clearly weren't planning to take months. They were building something that looked close to finished already. That evening, a new set of signs appeared along the shoreline. Blue metal plaques mounted on wooden posts. The one nearest my dock read, Westbend HOA Community Infrastructure Zone Unauthorized Access Prohibited. I stood there staring at that sign for a long time. My dock had been in that exact spot for over 40 years. My father tied his fishing boat to that post every weekend during the summer. The idea that someone had hammered a sign into the ground declaring it part of a community infrastructure zone felt surreal. A neighbor walking his dog slowed down when he saw me reading it. He gave me an awkward smile and said Carla told everyone the new power system would save residents money during outages. I didn't answer him. I just kept looking at the sign. Later that night, I called Carla directly. It went to voicemail again. I left a message telling her the sign was on private property and needed to be removed. She didn't return the call. The following morning, a courier delivered a letter from the HOA's legal counsel warning me not to interfere with official signage related to the energy project. According to the letter, attempting to remove those signs could result in fines. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Until then, I had still been trying to solve the problem the normal way. Emails, meetings, lawyers. But standing there with that letter in my hand while construction crews worked across the lake made something very clear. The HOA had already decided how this story would end. They believed they would finish the power station, connect it to their grid, and by the time a judge looked at the paperwork, the system would already be running. At that point, shutting it down would be politically messy, maybe even unpopular with the rest of the neighborhood. In other words, they were counting on momentum. What they weren't counting on was the one thing they had never asked about when they started planning the project. The lake itself, not the shoreline boundaries or the zoning overlays or the glossy diagrams in their newsletters. The actual structure beneath the water. Because the lake my father built wasn't just a pond. It was a reservoir. And reservoirs have systems built into them that most people never think about. Systems designed to control water levels when storms hit or when the basin needs to be drained for maintenance. My father believed in building things to last longer than the people using them. That philosophy is why, buried beneath decades of silt and algae near the deepest point of the lake, there is a steel valve connected to a reinforced drainage pipe that ran half a mile downhill to a protected wetland catchment area. I helped install that system when I was still in high school. At the time, I thought it was unnecessary over-engineering. We lived in a quiet rural area. Flood control seemed like something cities worried about. Not us. But my father insisted. If you're going to build something that holds water, he said, you also build a way to release it. That valve hadn't been touched in decades. Most people in West Bend probably didn't even know it existed. But the moment I walked down to the shoreline that evening and looked out at the platform where Greenspark was bolting their turbine housing into place, I realized something that made my pulse quicken. The engineers had anchored the entire structure almost directly above the outlet channel that fed the drainage pipe. They hadn't chosen that spot randomly. From a hydroelectric standpoint, it probably looked ideal. Deep water, stable footing, perfect location for an intake system. Unfortunately for them, it also happened to be the exact place where the lake depended on constant water pressure to stay full. And if that pressure disappeared, everything resting on the surface would suddenly have a very serious problem. Once I realized where they had anchored that platform, I stopped thinking about lawyers and meetings for a while. Not because those things didn't matter anymore, but because something more important had become clear. Westbend HOA believed they understood the lake. They had surveyors, consultants, engineers from Greenspark Energy. They had diagrams, permits, presentations. But none of those people had ever been there when the lake was actually built. None of them had spent 2 summers watching my father shape the basin, run pipes through the hillside, and design a drainage system most people would never notice. They saw water and depth charts. My father saw structure, and buried in that structure was the one thing none of them knew existed. That night, I pulled the old storage box from the back of the study closet. The lid creaked when I opened it, releasing the smell of old paper and machine oil. Inside were the original construction notes from when the lake was dug in the 70s. Handwritten measurements, soil reports, drainage diagrams, and a folded map showing the underground pipe network that fed into the emergency release valve. I spread everything across the desk and studied the layout for almost an hour. The outlet pipe ran exactly where I remembered, starting beneath the deepest section of the basin and traveling downhill toward a protected wetland area the county designated decades ago as Catchment Zone 43B. That wetland designation mattered. It meant the drainage system wasn't just some improvised farm pipe. It had been registered as part of a legitimate runoff control structure when my father filed the original land use paperwork. In other words, the valve wasn't just a mechanical feature. It was a legal one, too. The next morning, I drove out to the west side of the property where the spillway access hatch sat hidden beneath a patch of reeds and old brush. Most people walking past it would never notice the concrete slab tucked into the ground. The bolts were rusted but intact. I cleared away the leaves and crouched down long enough to brush the dirt off the surface. Beneath that slab sat the control shaft connected to the valve assembly at the bottom of the pipe. I hadn't opened it in years, but I still remembered the way the mechanism worked. A heavy iron crank fit into a slot at the top of the gearbox. Turn it slowly, and the gate inside the pipe would lift, releasing water from the lake and sending it through the drainage channel toward the wetland basin. The system had been designed to handle overflow from heavy storms. Under normal conditions, the valve stayed sealed. Standing there beside the hatch, I felt a strange mix of calm and tension settle into my chest. Not excitement. Not yet. Just the quiet awareness that something important was sitting a few feet below my boots while the entire neighborhood believed the lake above it belonged to them. I didn't open the hatch that day. Instead, I drove into town and met with my attorney again. I brought the old construction diagrams and explained the drainage system in detail. He studied the documents carefully and asked several questions about the wetland catchment area. When I showed him the certification records my father filed years ago, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a long look. According to the paperwork, the drainage system was still active and recognized as part of the property's water management infrastructure. Activating it wouldn't automatically violate any laws as long as the downstream flow limits stayed within the approved range. That last part was important. My father built the pipe wide enough to handle significant runoff without exceeding the capacity of the wetland basin. My attorney didn't tell me to open the valve. He didn't have to. He simply confirmed that the system existed and that the rights attached to it still belonged to the landowner. After that conversation, I drove back home and walked down to the shoreline again. Construction had moved even further ahead while I was gone. The turbine housing was now mounted to the platform, and technicians were running cables through a control box near the generators. I could hear the clank of metal tools from across the water while a pair of engineers crouched beside a laptop, studying readings from the intake system. They were so focused on their equipment that none of them noticed me standing there watching. Later that evening, I saw something that told me exactly how close they were to finishing the job. Carla Whitmore walked out onto the platform with a small group of residents following behind her. One of the Greenspark engineers handed her a pair of ceremonial scissors while someone else held a narrow ribbon across the entrance to the control housing. It wasn't an official opening yet, but the message was obvious. They were celebrating. A few of the residents clapped as Carla cut the ribbon and posed for pictures beside the turbine. I stood on my dock looking across the lake while that little ceremony played out under the floodlights. No one on that platform had ever knocked on my door to ask permission. No one had asked how the lake worked or what systems were hidden beneath it. They had simply decided the water was part of their community infrastructure now. The next morning, a new message appeared on the HOA community page online. A photo of Carla standing beside the turbine with a caption announcing the upcoming launch of the Westbend Smart Grid Hub. According to the post, the system would be fully operational by Monday if testing went smoothly. Monday. That gave them 3 days. I spent most of that afternoon walking the perimeter of the lake, checking landmarks I hadn't paid much attention to in years. The dock my father built, the old cedar posts marking the original shoreline, the shallow inlet where we used to launch a small rowboat when I was younger. Every place carried some memory tied to the years before West Bend expanded into the surrounding farmland. By the time the sun dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the water, I found myself standing once again beside the spillway hatch hidden in the reeds. I brushed the dirt away from the bolts and rested my hand on the cool concrete surface. For a long moment, I just stood there listening to the faint hum of the generators across the lake. Then I returned to the house and wrote one more letter. It wasn't long. Just a single page explaining that the lake and its infrastructure belonged to the Hartland property and that any equipment placed on or within it was there without permission. At the bottom, I included one final notice. All personnel and machinery must be removed from the lake before midnight Sunday. After that point, I would no longer be responsible for maintaining water levels required for their construction platform. I printed the letter, signed it, and drove to the HOA office to slide it under the door. Whether Carla believed I would actually follow through didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that she had been warned. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. Construction slowed on Saturday, while the engineers ran system diagnostics. I could see them moving back and forth across the platform with tablets in their hands, checking readings from the intake pipe and the turbine housing. Occasionally, someone would adjust a valve or tighten a connection before stepping back to observe the results. From their perspective, the system was almost complete. The lake looked the same as it always had from the outside. Calm water, steady depth. Nothing that suggested the entire basin depended on a single steel gate buried beneath the mud near the western shore. Late Sunday evening, I walked down to the spillway, hatch one more time. The sky had already darkened, and the floodlights from the construction platform cast a pale reflection across the water. I set my phone on a nearby rock and turned on the camera so the timestamp would record everything clearly. Then I knelt beside the hatch and loosened the bolts one by one until the heavy slab lifted free. Cool air drifted up from the shaft beneath, it carrying the faint metallic smell of old machinery. At the bottom of the shaft, the gearbox waited exactly where I remembered. The crank slot was still intact. I reached into the shed behind the boathouse and brought back the iron handle my father kept hanging on the wall all those years. It slid into the slot with a solid click. I didn't turn it yet. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking out across the water at the bright cluster of lights surrounding the platform. From that distance, the turbine housing looked almost finished. In a few hours, the engineers would probably be celebrating the launch of their neighborhood power system. What they didn't know was that the lake beneath them was only full because a steel gate the size of a dinner table was still closed at the bottom of a drainage pipe they had never bothered to look for. And in just a little while, that gate was going to move. Midnight arrived quietly. No wind, no thunder, nothing dramatic. Just the steady hum of the generators across the lake and the faint ticking of my kitchen clock as the minute hand moved into place. I had been sitting at the table for almost an hour, not because I was unsure about what I was about to do, but because I wanted the moment to be exact. The letter I delivered to the HOA office gave them until midnight Sunday. Not 11:59, not midnight-ish. Midnight. When the clock on the wall finally rolled over, I stood up, grabbed the iron crank handle, and walked out the back door. The air outside was cool and still. From the ridge behind the house, I could see the platform clearly. Floodlights washed the entire structure in white light, while a couple of engineers moved around the control housing. They looked relaxed. One of them leaned against the railing, scrolling through something on his phone, while another adjusted a cable near the generator. If they noticed me walking along the path toward the spillway hatch, they didn't show it. I reached the hatch and stepped down into the narrow shaft where the gearbox waited at the bottom. My phone was already recording from the ledge where I had set it earlier. I spoke clearly into the camera for the record. My name, the date, the property designation, and the fact that the lake and its water management system were part of Heartland land registered decades before Westbend even existed. I explained that construction equipment had been placed on the water without permission despite multiple warnings. Then I took hold of the crank. The metal felt colder than I expected. The first quarter turn was slow. The gears inside the box resisted at first, then shifted with a deep grinding sound that echoed faintly through the shaft. I paused, adjusted my grip, and turned again. Somewhere below the mud at the bottom of the lake, a steel gate began to lift. The movement wasn't dramatic. No explosions. No rushing noise yet. Just a vibration that traveled up the handle into my arms as the mechanism woke up after decades of silence. I gave it another careful turn, then another, until the crank rotated smoothly. When I climbed back out of the shaft and replaced the hatch loosely over the opening, the lake still looked unchanged. The surface lay flat and quiet under the moonlight, the platform lights glowing at the far end like a small floating city. But beneath that calm surface, thousands of gallons of water were already moving through the drainage pipe, sliding downhill toward the wetland catchment area exactly the way my father designed it to. I walked back toward the dock and waited. At first, nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I noticed the shoreline closest to me looked slightly different. A narrow strip of dark mud appeared where the waterline had been touching the grass earlier that evening. The lake had dropped perhaps an inch. Not much, but enough to tell me the valve was working. I checked my watch. 12:15. The hum of the generators across the lake continued without interruption. Another few minutes passed before the change became impossible to ignore. The waterline receded another several inches, exposing the lower rings on the dock pilings. Out near the platform, one of the engineers glanced over the railing as if something had caught his attention. He leaned down, shining a flashlight along the surface of the water near the intake pipe. A moment later, another engineer joined him. They talked for a few seconds and then disappeared inside the control housing. My phone rang at 12:27. I looked at the number and didn't recognize it, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was tense. The man introduced himself as Matthews, lead engineer for Greenspark. He said their system monitors were showing a sudden drop in water pressure at the intake and asked if I had noticed any unusual activity around the lake. I told him yes. I had initiated a controlled release through the property's drainage system. There was a brief silence. Then his voice sharpened. He said that kind of action would destabilize the hydro system and asked if I understood the consequences. I told him he had roughly 10 minutes before the platform footing became unsafe. If I were standing where he was, I suggested I would begin evacuating the equipment immediately. The line went dead. When I looked back across the lake, the engineers were already moving quickly across the platform. One of them ran to the generator panel, while another shouted something toward the shoreline. The water continued to fall. By 12:40, the level had dropped nearly 3 feet. The change transformed the entire basin. The dock posts rose higher above the surface, and a wide crescent of mud appeared along the western bank. Out near the center of the lake, the platform began to tilt slightly as the flotation pontoons adjusted to the sudden loss of depth beneath them. I could hear voices now. Sharp commands carried faintly across the water. Someone switched off the floodlights for a moment before they flickered back on again. At 12:45, the turbine system failed completely. The generators sputtered once and then died, plunging the platform into darkness except for a few emergency lights inside the control housing. The silence that followed was almost shocking. For weeks, the lake had been filled with the constant drone of machinery. Now the only sound was the slow movement of water draining away beneath the surface. My phone rang again. This time a name on the screen read Carla Whitmore. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice came through tight and controlled. She asked what exactly I thought I was doing. I told her I had activated a drainage system on private property after repeated warnings were ignored. She said I was sabotaging critical infrastructure and that the HOA would pursue legal action immediately. I reminded her that the infrastructure in question had been built on land the HOA did not own. The conversation ended abruptly after that. I stepped down from the dock and walked along the newly exposed shoreline, shining my flashlight across the mud. By 1 a.m, the lake had lost nearly half its volume. The platform that had floated confidently in the center only hours earlier now sat crooked on the soft lake bed, one corner sinking slightly into the mud, while the other side remained supported by the remaining water. Workers scrambled across the deck, dragging cables and tools toward the shore ramp they had installed for equipment transport. One man slipped and nearly fell while trying to move a generator unit toward higher ground. A black SUV arrived on the access road shortly after 1:15, its headlights sweeping across the basin before stopping near the shoreline. Carla stepped out wearing a long coat over her blazer. Even from the distance, I could see her shoes sinking into the wet mud as she approached the stranded platform. She spoke rapidly with one of the engineers, pointing toward the waterline as if demanding an explanation. When he gestured toward the western shore where I stood, she turned and stared across the basin for several seconds. I didn't wave. I just watched. A county utility truck arrived around 2 a.m, followed by another vehicle carrying municipal inspectors. They began documenting the site, while the Greenspark crew attempted to stabilize what remained of their equipment. By then, the lake had dropped past the midpoint of the basin, revealing stretches of cracked sediment and old debris that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The turbine housing leaned awkwardly against the tilted frame of the platform, its intake pipe bent under the sudden change in pressure. I returned briefly to the spillway hatch around 2:30 and gave the crank one final turn to secure the valve at a steady release rate. The worst of the drainage had already happened. From here, the lake would stabilize near the engineered low water level my father designed for maintenance periods. When I climbed back to the surface, the eastern horizon was beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. Across the basin, the once proud Westbend power platform sat stranded in the mud like a broken raft, its cables hanging loose while a handful of exhausted engineers argued quietly near the control housing. The lake wasn't empty, but it was no longer theirs. And for the first time in weeks, the night was completely silent. Morning came faster than I expected. I must have slept for an hour at most, maybe less, sitting in a chair near the window where I could still see the basin of the lake. When I stepped outside, just after sunrise, the air had that cold, quiet feeling that comes after something big has already happened. The lake had stabilized exactly where my father designed it to. A wide ring of exposed mud circled the basin, and the floating platform that Greenspark had spent weeks assembling now sat stranded at a crooked angle in the center of the exposed lake bed. The turbine housing leaned against its frame like something abandoned. For the first time since construction began, there was no mechanical noise anywhere on the water. No generators, no metal clanging, just the distant sound of a crow somewhere along the tree line and the quiet sucking noise of mud settling under its own weight. It didn't stay quiet for long. The first group of residents showed up just after 7. A couple of cars pulled onto the gravel access road overlooking the lake, then another. People got out slowly, walking toward the edge of the basin with the confused posture of someone trying to understand what they were looking at. Most of them had gone to bed the night before, believing the new backup power system would go online in a few days. Instead, they were staring at a drained reservoir and a stranded construction site. Voices started rising almost immediately. Questions at first, then complaints. I could hear bits of conversation drifting across the distance. Someone asking why the lake was empty. Someone else mentioning the power outage during the night when the system shut down. A man near the shoreline held up his phone and took pictures of the tilted platform. Around 7:20, a white news van rolled slowly down the road behind the gathering residents. The reporter stepped out with a camera crew and began filming the scene from several angles while talking quietly into a microphone. Apparently, someone in the neighborhood had already contacted the local station about the sudden disappearance of half the lake. I stayed on my side of the basin for a while, watching from the ridge near the house. There was no point in joining the crowd yet. The situation was already moving faster than any explanation I could give. By 8 o'clock, several official vehicles had arrived. County inspectors, a utility truck, and eventually a pair of SUVs marked with environmental agency logos. The officials moved carefully across the exposed lake bed, documenting the damage to the intake system and the collapsed piping near the platform. One of the inspectors knelt beside the twisted intake pipe and shook his head slowly while writing something on a clipboard. The whole scene looked less like a construction site now and more like the aftermath of a small shipwreck. Carla Whitmore arrived shortly after 8. She stepped out of a dark sedan near the HOA office building and walked quickly toward the group of inspectors already gathered near the stranded platform. Even from across the basin, I could tell she had not slept much either. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and the confident posture she carried at the meetings had been replaced by a sharp urgency in the way she moved. I watched as she began speaking rapidly to one of the county officials, gesturing toward the exposed shoreline and then pointing across the lake in my direction. The official listened without interrupting. When she finished, he simply turned and looked across the basin toward me. That was my signal to walk down. By the time I reached the caution tape, they had stretched around the construction area. Several cameras had already turned in my direction. A few residents stepped aside to let me pass. I recognized some of them from the HOA meeting weeks earlier. The same people who had applauded during Carla's ribbon cutting. Now their expressions were less enthusiastic. One of the county inspectors introduced himself and asked if I was Jake Harland. I told him I was. He explained that the drainage system connected to the lake had been activated sometime after midnight and that they needed confirmation about the property infrastructure involved. I handed him the folder I had prepared the night before. Inside were copies of the original deed, the plat map, the drainage system certification, and the sworn statement I recorded before opening the valve. The inspector read through the documents carefully while the rest of the officials waited. Carla attempted to interrupt him several times, insisting the situation represented sabotage of community infrastructure, but he held up a hand for silence until he finished reviewing the paperwork. When he finally looked up, his expression was neutral but firm. According to the records, the drainage valve and outlet pipe were registered components of a runoff control system built on Heartland property decades earlier. Activating it did not automatically violate any environmental restrictions because the downstream wetland catchment was designed to receive controlled discharge. In other words, the lake had been drained through a legal mechanism owned by the landholder. Carla stared at him as if she expected the conclusion to be different. When she tried to argue again, he calmly explained that the larger issue now involved the placement of construction equipment on private water without confirmed property authorization. That statement changed the tone of the entire gathering almost instantly. The reporters turned their cameras toward Carla while the inspectors began placing additional markers around the damaged platform. Within an hour, the county issued a temporary stop work order for the Westbend Energy initiative pending a full environmental and property compliance review. The words temporary sounded polite, but everyone standing there understood what they really meant. The project was finished. By mid-morning, the news crews had begun interviewing residents near the shoreline. Some of them spoke openly about the power outage that occurred when the turbine system collapsed during the night. Others expressed frustration that the HOA had promised reliable backup energy without clearly explaining where the system would be built. A few neighbors who had avoided eye contact with me for weeks suddenly found the courage to walk over and ask questions about the lake. One older man even apologized quietly for assuming the HOA had already settled the property dispute before construction began. Around noon, the first federal vehicle arrived. 2 environmental inspectors stepped out and walked directly to the exposed intake structure beneath the platform. They spent nearly half an hour examining the bent pipe and the mud surrounding the base of the installation. Eventually, one of them joined the county officials near the caution tape where I was standing. He reviewed the documentation I had provided earlier and asked several technical questions about the drainage valve and the downstream wetland basin. When I showed him the flow rate calculations from the original certification, he nodded and closed the folder. The primary compliance concern, he explained, would now focus on the unauthorized placement of hydroelectric equipment inside a protected runoff corridor. Carla didn't say much after that. By mid-afternoon, she had retreated toward the HOA office building while the inspectors continued documenting the site. The residents gradually dispersed as the reality of the situation settled in. The power station that had been advertised as the future of Westbend Energy independence now sat half-buried in mud under a collection of official stop work notices. I walked back to the house sometime after 3 and sat on the porch with Barron and Murphy stretched out beside my chair. From that distance, the basin of the lake looked quiet again. Not empty, just resting at the low water level my father once described as the lake's breathing point. Over the next few weeks, the rest of the story unfolded exactly the way my attorney predicted it would. Greenspark Energy quietly removed the damaged turbine and platform components under supervision from the county. The HOA issued a formal statement acknowledging that portions of the lake fell within privately owned Heartland property and that the Greenbelt designation had been applied incorrectly during the planning phase of the energy initiative. Carla Whitmore resigned from her position 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons. The legal settlement that followed required the HOA and its contractors to cover the full cost of removing the remaining construction debris from the basin, along with compensation for property damages and legal fees. None of it felt like a victory in the dramatic sense people on the internet like to talk about. It felt more like something being put back where it belonged. A month after the last truck hauled away the final pieces of the platform, I returned to the spillway hatch and slowly closed the drainage valve. Groundwater and seasonal runoff began filling the basin again over the following weeks. The lake rose inch by inch until the dock posts touched the surface the way they always had. The ducks came back first, gliding across the water like nothing unusual had ever happened. One evening near sunset, I sat at the edge of the dock watching the ripples move across the surface while the dogs dozed behind me on the grass. The lake looked the same as it did before all of this started. Quiet, ordinary, the way my father intended it to be when he first carved the basin into the land almost 50 years earlier. People sometimes ask if I regret draining it that night. The truth is I don't think about it that way. The lake never stopped being what it was built to be, a reservoir with a system designed to release water when it needed to. All I did was remind a few people that ownership isn't decided by meetings or glossy newsletters. It's decided by the ground beneath your feet and the work that went into shaping it long before anyone else showed up to claim it. And that lake, for better or worse, has always belonged to the Harlands.